He smiled as the world laughed, because they thought it was all just jokes. But tonight, Michael B. Jordan wasn't here to joke. He was here to reclaim the spotlight a legend once snatched away, live on international TV. What started as comedy soon swerved into a masterclass in vengeance, timing, and buried truth. A silver-haired icon, a rising king, and one moment that flipped the power dynamic in Hollywood forever. What did George Clooney do years ago that made this roast feel so personal? Is it still funny when the punchline is you? The stage lights flickered like nervous glances, dancing off tuxedos and sequined gowns as the Golden Globe Awards kicked off in uncharacteristically chaotic fashion. The crowd was already buzzing. Rumors had swirled all week about a surprise co-host. Then, as the velvet curtain parted, George Clooney stepped out, suave as ever, and with that trademark smirk, he teased the reveal. Tonight's co-host is a man of action, heartthrob status, and, as of tonight, revenge. A hush fell over the ballroom. From stage right emerged Michael B. Jordan, decked out in a midnight blue tux, smirking like a man who had been waiting years for this moment. The applause was thunderous, but beneath the surface, tension snapped like piano wire. The audience laughed as Clooney leaned in for a bro hug, but Michael's hand lingered just a second longer than it should have, his eyes locking with Clooney with unnerving precision. The energy felt off. What no one in that glittering crowd knew was that this wasn't a last-minute surprise. Jordan had been maneuvering this moment for months. It had taken charm, finesse, and a few well-placed calls to mutual industry friends to pull off the greatest double-cross in award show history. Clooney thought he'd orchestrated a light-hearted prank by inviting Jordan last minute, a friendly jab, a public roasting of the younger generation. What he hadn't realized was that Jordan had seen the offer coming weeks in advance and accepted it not as a joke, but as a loaded opportunity. "I hear George wanted someone with charisma tonight," Jordan quipped in his opening monologue, his voice smooth as velvet. But unfortunately, Brad Pitt was busy. The audience roared. Clooney chuckled, but there was something about the way his jaw tightened that betrayed him. The first jab had landed. And it wouldn't be the last. For the next hour, Jordan flawlessly danced between gracious host and ruthless sniper, weaving barbs that could be mistaken for compliments by the untrained ear. "Isn't it amazing that George has been relevant in 5 different decades? That's gotta be exhausting," he said to another wave of applause. The camera panned to Clooney, whose laugh had now become visibly forced. Jordan's comedic timing was sharp, but it wasn't just the words, it was the delivery. The calm control. The sense that he wasn't just improvising, but enacting a script rehearsed 1,000 times in his head. One that ended not in laughter, but in reckoning. Clooney glanced once toward the teleprompter, then toward the producers backstage. But this wasn't their show anymore. It was Jordan's. Years before the tuxedos, the smirks, and the sniping banter, Michael B. Jordan was a rising name hustling his way through the unforgiving labyrinth of Hollywood. It was a time when recognition was fleeting and roles were scarce, especially for someone trying to break into an industry that didn't hand over the torch. It made you wrestle for it. At 24, Michael had been invited to a black-tie industry gala where he wasn't a speaker or an honoree, but just a hopeful actor seated at a table near the back, grateful for the seat but aware it wasn't near the power. Clooney had been the headliner that night, the guest of honor, the man everyone orbited around. Midway through his speech, somewhere between a joke about his tequila brand and a jab at studio executives, Clooney had looked down into the crowd, squinting at the shadows beyond the first few rows, and suddenly pointed. "And there's Michael B. Jordan, there he is. Man, you were incredible in that Fruitvale movie. Haven't seen you since, oh wait, yeah, we haven't had you back." Laughter erupted. But Michael didn't laugh. Neither did the few casting directors at the table nearby, who turned their heads slowly toward him, then whispered into wine glasses. It was brushed off as just another Clooney joke. But for Michael, it burned like acid. The cameras weren't rolling that night. There were no internet clips, no social media storm. Just one offhand remark from a Hollywood legend that quietly cemented an impression. Jordan was talented, but not quite inner circle enough. The fallout was subtle and systemic. A high-profile audition Michael was lined up for the following week was suddenly postponed, then mysteriously cancelled. A producer who'd been courting his agent for a role in a major franchise stopped returning calls. The momentum he'd fought for all year began to wobble. What no one saw was the storm it ignited behind his calm demeanor. Michael wasn't a man to retaliate publicly. He never addressed the moment in interviews, never took to Twitter with cryptic subtweets. But he remembered. He remembered how humiliation, even masked in humor, could fracture careers. And he remembered the way Clooney smiled while doing it, like a man untouchable, protected by decades of charm and prestige. So he made a silent vow. Not for revenge. For redemption. For power on his own terms. He dove deeper into his craft, sharpening himself like a blade, taking on roles that weren't just crowd pleasers but soul stirrers. His breakout as Killmonger wasn't just a performance, it was a manifesto, rage wrapped in charisma, pain dressed as purpose. He produced, he directed, he built empires behind the scenes while everyone else thought he was just playing catch-up. And through it all, he kept a private list. A mental ledger of every public humiliation, every moment of dismissive laughter, every gate that refused to open. Clooney's name was circled at the top, not in hatred, but as a milestone. A target to surpass, then confront. So when the Golden Globes team approached him with the co-hosting idea, dangling it like a golden carrot, he didn't even blink. He knew Clooney was behind it. Knew it was supposed to be a soft ambush, one last laugh from a man who thought he still held the upper hand. What Clooney didn't know was that Michael had already written his jokes, already chosen his suit, and already decided that this would be the night the past stood trial. Not with venom, but with precision. And a smile. The audience had no idea the war had begun. They clinked glasses and chuckled through monologues, thinking they were witnessing friendly banter, a comedic handshake between two generations of Hollywood icons. But under the warm stage lights, something colder pulsed beneath the surface. Michael B. Jordan wasn't improvising his lines, he was executing a plan, each joke calibrated with surgical precision, each pause and eyebrow raise rehearsed like a fighter's feint before the punch. Clooney, still flashing that diplomatic smile, was starting to sense the shift. At first, he laughed too early. Then, not at all. Because Jordan was beginning to dig deeper. Not just into Clooney's age or his movies, but into the myth of Clooney himself. "George is one of the only guys I know who can make a tux look tired," Michael quipped with a wink to the crowd. "It's like, at some point, the tux begs to be worn by someone born after disco." The room howled. But the air between the two men thickened. Then came the first direct hit, a story Michael delivered with the ease of a seasoned comedian, but with the undertone of a confession long overdue. "You know," he said, "back when I was just starting out, I wrote ads. Just temp gigs, trying to keep the lights on. One time, I ghostwrote these mock campaigns for an international coffee brand. I pitched this whole suave, mysterious tone, black and white visuals, slow voiceovers, existential lines about espresso and regret. Didn't think much of it. Until a month later, I saw George Clooney sipping my words on a yacht in Italy." A beat of silence. Then laughter. Then scattered gasps. Clooney froze for a half-second, then offered a tight smile, the kind actors reserve for red carpets and courtroom testimony. "I should have gotten you royalties," he said, his voice even. "Yeah," Jordan replied. "Or just a callback." The laughter this time wasn't as loud. People were starting to realize that this wasn't a roast. It was a reckoning. A decade's worth of quiet slights and suppressed ambition was being aired out, not with bitterness, but with brilliance. And the timing was ruthless. Jordan launched into a segment introducing lifetime achievement winners, but not before another subtle barb. "Let's honor people who've lifted others up, even when they could have held them down to shine." That line didn't land like a joke. It hit like a verdict. Clooney shifted in his seat, adjusting his bow tie. The cameras caught it. The producers backstage were suddenly whispering, unsure whether they were watching comedy or a career car crash in slow motion. But Jordan wasn't spiraling. He was climbing. This wasn't sabotage, it was theater. And the crowd, though unsure, was locked in. The way he held the room with charm and composure, never letting it descend into spite, made his barbs even sharper. Clooney, for all his years in front of the camera, looked for the first time like he wanted to be anywhere else. And that was the real trick. Jordan wasn't trying to destroy Clooney. He was doing something far more unsettling. He was showing the world that the icon was no longer untouchable. That the apprentice had become the master. That sometimes, the roast is just a delivery system for truth the world refused to hear the first time around. As the ceremony rolled into its second hour, the laughter in the room began to sound different. Less buoyant, more cautious, like guests slowly realizing they were seated ringside for a prizefight in disguise. The stage still glowed gold, the orchestra still played between segments, but there was a new gravity to every exchange. Michael B. Jordan, still as charismatic as ever, returned from the wings for the next presenter cue with a vintage espresso cup in hand. "I figured I'd need something strong," he grinned, holding the cup up like a prop, "because this next segment gets real." The joke earned a ripple of nervous laughter, but George Clooney's smile had now completely disappeared, replaced by something unreadable. Michael didn't wait. He leaned casually against the podium, eyes sweeping the crowd like a general before battle. "So let me tell y'all a little story," he said, tone deceptively light. "When I was 19, I interned at an agency that handled a lot of A-listers image work. Back then, I was broke, invisible, and overqualified. 3 things that Hollywood loves to ignore. But one day, they handed me a brief. Italian luxury, coffee, and cool. They said, write us something Clooney would say. And I did. I wrote 30 taglines. One of them became the brand's entire identity." The audience murmured. Jordan continued. "I didn't get credit, of course. I was just a kid with a laptop and a vending machine lunch. But I remember the tagline, 'What else?'" The room went completely silent. That phrase, uttered countless times in suave black and white Clooney commercials, had become iconic, synonymous with elegance, with worldliness, with George. And now, in a single sentence, Michael had cracked the illusion. "Crazy thing is," he said with a raised brow, "I didn't even drink espresso back then. But I sure knew what it felt like to pretend to be someone I wasn't, just to get a foot in the door." His words landed like a gut punch wrapped in silk. People weren't laughing anymore. They were staring. Even the camera operators, seasoned veterans of Hollywood glitz, were holding their breaths behind the lens. Clooney adjusted his cufflink, a micro-movement magnified tenfold by the silence. Michael placed the espresso cup down with deliberate care. "See, it's not about who says the line," he said, looking toward Clooney. "It's about who needed to say it more." And with that, he turned back to the teleprompter, flawlessly pivoting into the next segment. But the message had been delivered. The illusion of control Clooney had carefully curated throughout decades of career-defining charm had just been chipped away, not by scandal or gossip, but by a truth delivered with poise and wit. Jordan hadn't just told a story, he'd reframed the audience's perception of history, injected doubt into a legacy, and reclaimed a moment he'd been denied before he even had a chance to fight for it. The espresso campaign was never about coffee. It was about image, authorship, and the erasure that young, black creatives faced in silence. Tonight, that silence ended. The camera cut to Clooney just long enough to catch the flash of realization in his eyes. The crowd applauded the segment, but the applause was now a slow wave, unsure, complex, laced with a new awareness. And somewhere in the back of the room, a junior screenwriter watching the show texted a friend, "Did Michael B. just rewrite Hollywood history in real time?" Yes, he did. The moment cracked not with a scream but with stillness. Clooney had been quiet for too long, his silence now louder than anything Michael could say. The audience, sensing something electric hanging in the air, watched him like a hawk cornered. Jordan had just returned backstage for a momentary break while the next award was being presented, but his shadow still loomed, his words still echoing in the seams of the theater's golden drapes. Then, unexpectedly, Clooney rose from his seat. He didn't wait for a prompt or a camera cue. He walked straight to the stage, past startled producers and a bewildered presenter mid-speech, and took the mic. The audience fell into a hush that felt biblical. "Can I say something?" Clooney asked, not to anyone in particular but to the room itself, the world beyond the cameras, maybe even to his own past. He let out a breath, then met the audience with a rawness that hadn't been part of the script. "What Michael said about the coffee campaign, it's true. A soft gasp fluttered across the crowd like wind over water. I read that tagline in a stack of agency briefs, he continued, eyes scanning the faces before him. It stood out. It had soul. I asked who wrote it. They said some intern. I didn't push. I used it. I made it my own. His voice cracked on the last word. Because that's what this industry teaches you to do: take, polish, perform. But sometimes, what you take costs someone else more than you'll ever know. The confession wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was seismic. Clooney, the silver-tongued diplomat of Hollywood, was stripping himself of armor. The thing is, he said, turning slightly to the side as if facing a ghost only he could see, I didn't just take his words. I kept him in the margins. Not deliberately, not maliciously, but because part of me was afraid. Afraid of how good he was. How much heat he carried. And yeah, maybe afraid that people might realize I was only ever as iconic as the team behind the curtain. Some audience members stared, unblinking. Others glanced around, searching for Jordan, wondering if he would reappear. But Clooney wasn't done. I didn't invite Michael here tonight as a prank. I thought if I brought him up, let him roast me, we'd both get some laughs and I'd seem like a good sport. But I didn't expect him to bring the truth. And I respect the hell out of that. It wasn't redemption, but it was acknowledgement. The kind that came too late for some things, but just in time for others. The kind that stung because it was so human. He stepped back, unsure of what to do next, and returned to his seat. For a long moment, no one clapped. Then a solitary applause began from the upper balcony. It spread slowly, a quiet ovation for a man admitting failure on his own stage. But in the wings, Michael stood with arms folded, his expression unreadable. He hadn't expected Clooney to bend. He thought the old guard never did. But now the chessboard had changed. Not just because of the moves made, but because one player had finally stopped pretending the game was friendly. Michael didn't rush back on stage. He waited. Let the moment breathe. Let the crowd sit with Clooney's words. Let silence do what applause never could. When he finally returned, it wasn't with fanfare or flashy music, it was just him, standing alone under a single spotlight, calm and composed. The tucks, the swagger, the jawline, all still there. But something had shifted. This wasn't just a roast anymore. It was something heavier. More surgical. And yet, somehow, more hopeful. He reached the podium, let his hand rest on the mic, and looked out into the sea of glittering faces, actors, producers, studio execs, influencers, all of whom now watched him with the kind of reverence rarely reserved for someone still breathing. We all love stories, he began, voice quiet but steady. That's why we're here. But sometimes, the best ones don't come from scripts. They come from people finally telling the truth. He didn't mention Clooney by name. He didn't have to. Everyone knew. I didn't come here to embarrass anyone, he said. I came here to reclaim something I never got to hold. Not credit. Not fame. Just respect. And in those words was the thesis of the entire night. Not vengeance. Not exposure. Just the desire to be seen fully, finally. He paused, then raised his glass, the same espresso cup from earlier now refilled, repurposed. To the ones who came before us, he said. And to the ones they underestimated. The crowd rose to their feet in waves. First the young actors, the ones who saw themselves in Jordan. Then the writers. Then, slowly, the veterans. Clooney stood too, a faint smile returning, softer this time, humbled. Their eyes met again, not as rivals now, but as men who had shed their armor for the world to see. Jordan stepped down from the stage without lingering. The show wrapped quickly after that, the final awards handed out almost mechanically, as if the audience already knew the real event had passed. Backstage, executives whispered furiously into phones. Not about the trophies or the ratings, but about Jordan. There was talk of new deals, franchise offers, Oscar-worthy scripts. But for Michael, none of that mattered in that moment. He didn't need the next gig to feel victorious. He had already won by telling a story no one else had the courage to say out loud. As he exited the venue through the back lot, away from the limos and flashing cameras, a young actor chased him down. He looked barely 21, starstruck but trying to stay cool. "How'd you do it?" he asked breathlessly. Jordan turned, smiled, and handed him the espresso cup. "Tell the truth," he said. "Then say it louder." And with that, he disappeared into the Los Angeles night, leaving behind a theater full of applause and a legacy that could no longer be overshadowed. What remained unsaid, what lingered in the breath between claps, was that Hollywood had just changed. Not with scandal, but with sincerity.